Hello. Welcome back to our journey from recovery to discovery. I'm John. I'm your host today and a human being trying my best to live my life on this path of discovery and freedom. Today, I would love to talk about something that we like to call love bombing. Love bombing is a term usually used in conjunction with describing cults and high control groups, and it has to do with the group and the believers in the group making a person coming into the group trying their best to make them feel like they belong and are accepted in the group. What could be bad about that, right? I mean, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing. It sounds like something that really could help people feel a part of. And I think that there are certain circumstances and situations where it can be a beautiful thing to welcome someone into a community. The problem comes when that welcoming in the community is also tied into having to identify with a label, especially when it's a label that dehumanizes people or that locks people into a way of thinking about themselves that in the end could turn out to be very destructive. So this goes for a lot of cults, not all of them, I would say, but a lot of them. And so in this context, I'm going to talk about 12-step programs and how love bombing is built into the system to try to make newcomers feel welcome and feel like they belong there, and in a sense kind of tap into our general need and desire for community and belonging. There are exceptions in a select number of human beings. There are hermits that exist that actually prefer life without belonging to a community or having other human beings around. But in general, I would say that to greater or lesser degrees, we all want to feel like we matter and are important to other people and belong to communities. So I'm going to go back in history a little bit to provide context for my own experience in the rooms and with love bombing. In my childhood, there was a divorce that happened between my mom and my dad when I was 3, and I spent every other day bouncing between houses. And I had a very loving and supportive mother and a father who had formed a pretty heavy habit with his work, pretty distant, some neglect there, and then him marrying my stepmother, who was very resentful, I would say, towards my mother, and projected that resentment through her treatment of me as a little 5-year-old boy. And so that broke down my sense of worthiness and value as a little boy, as a human being. And I took that perception into school with me. So I ended up transferring from kind of a smaller school to a really big public school. And on the first day of class in the 3rd grade, I was brutally assaulted by 2 6th grade boys. It was a horrible experience. And at that point, I made a childhood vow with myself that I would never put myself into social situations that would put me at risk in that way ever again. I understand why I did that at the time, but it ended up really holding me back in terms of fostering the connections that I so desperately wanted in my life. There was always that piece within that I wanted to be one of the cool kids. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to have a large group of friends that I loved and that loved me. And so that made me really, really ripe for being love bombed. Fast forward to 2019, when I had found myself in a circumstance where I was in a relationship, 11-year relationship, that turned toxic. I had never learned how to fill that void that I felt within myself at that point. And so she was very controlling. I didn't feel like I was going to be okay on my own or single. And so I was also needy at that time. It was not the best circumstances on both ends. I had become very isolated because she would get very jealous if I had friends. And I also had formed a harmful habit with certain substances at that point. I had found a therapist who she said something that really rang, it kind of parted the clouds, and it rang true for me when she said it. And she said, John, I would really love to walk alongside you on this journey to learn to love yourself, but I don't think that I'm going to be able to do it while you're using drugs. I see you coming into sessions high, I see you coming into sessions low, and everywhere in between. So she was actually the one who suggested and accompanied me to my first Narcotics Anonymous meeting. And I was at the point where I really was struggling, and I think deep down wanted to change. So I always have, I think, had a bit of a skill at speaking authentically and with vulnerability. And so I started doing that right off the bat when I began going to meetings. And I think that people picked up on that and resonated with it. And so I was love bombed very quickly, and given phone numbers and given hugs, and told by who were essentially strangers at that time that they loved me. Now, where this becomes harmful is there was a condition to all of that occurring. And that condition was that I had to step up in front of this room and identify myself as an addict. Without that, especially in the rooms, if a person tries to speak and they don't identify themselves as an addict or an alcoholic, they are given stern looks and really not seen as being a part of. And especially with the term addict or alcoholic, it is a limiting belief. It is once I really believed that about myself, then it oriented me in the direction of being in forever, right? Because in the ideology's standpoint, someone who struggled with substances in this circumstance can never actually recover. They can never actually move on from that problematic use, even if they've been clean for decades. This is the basis for why meetings exist, because we only get a daily reprieve. There is no moving on. There is no graduating. And research is out there that the norm is spontaneous remission. If given enough time and with enough love and care and support from, healthy support from just friends and family that encourage us that we can evolve and move on, most people leave their problematic substance use or whatever behavior it is, it doesn't even have to be drugs, behind and make a change. When the pain of the behavior becomes so intense and profound that moving on from it, even though I knew it was going to be hard and painful and challenging, it was a more desirable option than to continue to engage in that behavior. So the love bombing is very seductive on the front end. It really tapped into that desire from childhood of wanting to fit in and belong somewhere, and felt very healing right off the bat. After about my third meeting, my first sponsor approached me and said my name is blah blah blah, and I love you, and do you have a sponsor? And I would be happy to be your sponsor. And so that's kind of also what the members are groomed to do, is that their recovery depends on, in a sense, indoctrinating others into the program. And so it's kind of this symbiotic relationship between the newcomer coming into the rooms fresh from rehab, or just like me through a therapist, and then the member who's been a member for an extended period of time has learned that their recovery depends upon being of service to the newcomer. But the love is conditional. It is if a person begins dissenting or begins thinking in a way that is not in line with the ideology, that love is taken away. And this can be in really pronounced versions of that, and really subtle versions of that, right? So if I went into a meeting and said something along the lines of, this isn't really resonating with me anymore. I have all of these dreams and goals and ambitions, and I just don't really believe that I'm an addict, and I'm thinking about, moving on with my life, and those head nods, the seductive head nods, if you're like sharing what's in line with the dogma, those will disappear. The meetings after the meetings, right? The little cliques that form of people that are being social and going to coffee after the meeting, I won't be invited to those anymore. It's a process of shunning and withholding love and affection and connection unless I toe the party line and speak the way that everyone else is speaking, right? Groupthink. And all of this love bombing is constructed around the addict and the alcoholic identity. It is essential for us to remind ourselves at every opportunity that we are addicts, and that we are diseased, and that we are sick, and that we always, I remember in Narcotics Anonymous meetings, it's read at the beginning of every meeting, we must remember we are sick people, and then everyone in the room chants, sick! It keeps the members locked into a way of thinking that there is something missing within us, that we can't do it on our own, and that we need to stay in the rooms in order to get the daily solution. Because remember, we're diseased. So our disease is doing push-ups in the parking lot, always lying in wait. And so it all makes sense in the context of like how the organization was designed, and in a sense it's actually really brilliant, even if it is destructive. And I really believe that it is destructive because, especially in the US, we have, I think, the second highest amount of drug and alcohol overdoses every year, and we also have the most treatment. It's a $48 billion industrial complex. And so if you use any sort of model of critical thinking at all, I see that, like, what are the things that are connected? Like, most overdose deaths, most treatment. What if the treatment is actually causing people to think about themselves in a way that just causes them to never feel like they can move on, like they can never recover, and then set up the program, the ideology, as a near impossible standard to meet. And what I mean by that is there's this purity requirement of you have to not alter your consciousness one day at a time forever. And that's where the hierarchy of the program, I'm going to talk so much more in depth about all of this stuff, but I'm kind of going on a bit of a waffle right now. So essentially it's very likely that at some point a person who might have encountered the ideology will alter their consciousness again. And if they have that belief that they're an addict and that they've built up 13 years and they just threw it all away, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which lands them back into treatment, back into the system, back into the revolving door. And because they've been told over and over again and have built up this belief system that one is too many and 1,000 is never enough, then oftentimes it is really, really bad, which confirms that belief that they are an addict. And so, but it also feels like it's essential, like it's life or death to conform to the ideology, because our connections and friendships and relationships depend upon our capitulation to it. And it all started with being love bombed. The newcomer is the most important person in the room, which is like so seductive if you've been out there addicted and you're alone and it's just, you're in a very vulnerable place, and so it's like all of a sudden I'm important. What? And then after that 30 days when you're not announcing that you're a newcomer anymore, well, you're not so important. You gotta focus on the next newcomer that comes in. And especially if you were like me and had to do like 90 meetings in 90 days, I have been indoctrinated at that point. And so I really, really I started believing in all of this stuff. And I believed that, if I was going to leave the rooms, I was going to die. And that if I wasn't being of service to others, then, I was going to die and relapse. And so that process of love bombing is built into the system, and it's really damn near impossible to see what's going on until, like me, I dissented. There was a really crisis point that happened in my life that caused me to have a crack in my brainwashing and leave. And so it's like looking at something from the outside instead of being just immersed in it. Anyway, that is a little bit of my experience with love bombing. This also can happen in like narcissistic relationships, like cults of one, right? You can observe this happening in these types of systems and relationships where it's like people will kind of pretend to be very loving and then over time withdraw that love unless if you behave in this way, it'll be there. If you don't, it is withheld. And this can create a very, very toxic trauma bond, both in individual and group settings. I would love to know your experience with love bombing. I'm making these videos because in the 5, almost 6 actually, years since I've left, my experience has just been so pronounced and bubbling up within my being, and it now has come to a point where I think it feels essential for my growth to step out and dissent online. But this is not about me. This is actually about you, your experience, your process. So let me know in the comments your experience with love bombing, and I hope you have a absolutely magical, wonderful day. And yeah, I'm so proud of you and your courage for stepping out into the world and like reclaiming your freedom and taking your life back and defining your own process of discovery on your own terms. So all the best. See you next time.